Hey, it's Stu, and this video is going to be a bit of a check-in. I will go over what I've read, maybe a little bit about what I'm reading. There's one book, as usual, that's not quite finished, but I want to talk about it in context of these other books that I'm reading around it. And I kind of just want to say we're already, well, mid-April, and so talk a little bit about what's directing my my continually pretty intense TBR. So April is Arab American Heritage Month, and so I try to just take a moment to look through my shelves and see where I have Arab American and or translated and or Arab British. I think I was looking through as well, books, just to make sure I pull some of them. Well, that's on my mind. I'm still reading Booker International inspired books. I'll talk more about that in a sec. And the Women's Prize for Fiction current long list, and then I think a project for all of this year is the Women's Prize for Fiction backlist. I keep saying I want to make a video about that, and I do because I have a lot to say, and there's been a lot of of my contemplative time or planning around that. I'm kind of getting down to the very few prompts left for the 52 book club 2026 challenge, and there's a couple that I might just say, you know what, reading challenges are for fun, to inspire you to think about how you're reading. But if there's, for instance, a prompt that's just not for me, then I'm cool. I'm cool with that. So I'm still reading along with it, and a couple of videos to maybe come out on that. But that's really where the focus of my reading is. I've also been quite spontaneous. So if I find out about a book or hear about a book that I don't have or haven't found, so normally it's been thrifting that's been my sort of impetus to say I should read this book. Now, if I find out about a book and it's no longer just sort of on socials, I have now pretty wide array of places and people with whom I talk about books. I kind of spontaneously either put it on hold or Libby or check it out, and that's my way to not forget. And then I end up with with kind of a backlog of books in that regard as well. This week I'm gonna start, well, let me start with the book that I just finished, and the book that I have yet to finish and maybe won't. And those are Evil Eye by Etaf Rum. I selected, as this is a Palestinian American author, and the representation of Arab American Heritage Month, that kind of made me finally get to this book, which has been on my mind for quite a while. And The House on Via Gemito Street by Domenico Starnone, and translated by, Oma Stransky. What a beautiful book. And this book, the impetus for sort of getting to this book, because I'm getting to it as well, has been, it was long or shortlisted for the International Booker. Okay. In both of these books, the sort of commonality is that we have an adult child, an adult who was the child of an abusive marriage or an abusive family. The perpetrator of the abuse in both of these books is the father. And there's an interrogation in both of these books on the impact on this adult's life, and also how the memory that they have of the father, and the relationship that in both cases, the father is still alive, and they're contemplating how to maintain some kind of relationship and or respect, manage their feelings, and or understand their feelings towards their father. because it's very much toxic masculine domestic violence. They're both then contemplating toxic masculinity and the generational trauma that ensues due to it. Both are also contemplating war, the consequences of war, and people who are impacted, and the way that wars impact people. And in this book, there's a lot of reflection on it's Naples, and Naples sort of being home, and what being from a place for multiple generations means. And as we know, Palestinians are forced into exile or forced to live as refugees in their own homeland. Therefore, the idea of home has been made incredibly tenuous for an entire people. And this author, in some ways, not in the same way that happened in Paradiso 17 by Hannah Lilith Asadi, but I'm not sure, this is just me making the statement, how a Palestinian author isn't in some way confronting that reality, because that is the reality, as I said, of a population. So it is in, it's expected to be in, and it is in fact in this work, although it's not the central theme. This is a very domestic sort of fiction. I'm going to wage my own personal reflection now and criticism. I've said this before in videos, and I continue to say this and mean this. I'm struggling with Domenico Starnone's book because it is, quite simply put, the story of the man that contemplates really nothing more than the man and the man's point of view, and where its prose is quite beautiful and its work with art in relation even to this painting on the front is somewhat engaging for me. I'm finding similar sort of like, it's not necessarily fully my jam, so Zadie Smith's On Beauty 100 times for that over this, and Zadie Smith's On Beauty 100 times more for actually looking at the complexity of different people and how even toxic masculinity, and how the institutions that we all live in and try to survive and or thrive in impact each and every one of us in complex ways and differently depending on our positionality and the roles that we're forced to play inside of these institutions. This missed so many opportunities to the abuse of the mother in this book, to me, was only like the mother's suffering only served the purpose of the contemplation of this man trying to understand why his disdain for his father. But there is no, at least until now, I'm not completely done, but at least 3/4 of the way through, there is no, not even surface level attempt to understand the mother and the impact on the mother and the impact on this man's view of women, the author's view of women based on how this father has perpetrated the mother with domestic violence, both physical and emotional. This book looks at how that impacts the father, the mother, the daughter, future generations. And even though the criticism I would have of this book is a little too on the nose, and it read almost to me like a young adult. Some stories need to be told. Some people like stories told that way, but for me, it did sort of have that. That would be my criticism, is how I'll say it. But even in that sort of what I'm going to call almost simplicity or lack of density, the author still gets the assignment that there are more people in this world than the men. And how they're almost like almost even stereotypically impacted, where I don't think Domenico Starnone is really offering us anything new or exciting in almost any way. Of course, Naples sort of is like the home of all the crime fiction and the mobsters. And so to kind of have this, what I would say, more tender approach and this contemplative and reflective approach in juxtaposition to that, sure. But also, and so, the description of the setting I quite liked. And, you know, this pre-inter and war period has been looked at. Yeah, now so much in literature, it's also almost that too. Like, I'm like, okay, there can be books about other things, but that's what's happening in this one. I will see if I finish it. I was reading it outside in the sun yesterday, and I just gave up on it. I just said, you know what, I'm even almost starting to have some negative feelings towards those issues that I was saying to you, and I can't just sort of like compartmentalize them and say, it's okay, let me find the beauty in this book anyway. Not when I was also reading at the same time this, which offered me so much more in regards to what I was just speaking about, like looking at the impact on everyone around, and not just making any story be the story of the man. Okay, so there were those two books. I also kind of had a really big sea theme going on. This week I read quite a few books which were about the sea, and let me just kind of go through them, because the sea being sort of like the main setting, or even a character in some of these novels. It's still, there was a great amount of diversity of ideas and prose styles and plots happening within the context of the sea. So for Arab American Heritage Month, I picked up What a Strange Paradise by Omar El-Akkad. This is my second Omar El-Akkad book that I've read somewhat recently, and I hauled this book in Corvallis, Oregon, at a thrift store that was having a sale for educators. So, and it wasn't that long ago, probably 4 months ago. So one of my newer hauled books, we'll say, whereas Evil Eye I've had on my shelves now for over a year, but just over a year, and I hauled it at the Portland, Oregon, Multnomah Public Library, Central Libraries, Friends of the Library store. What a Strange Paradise. It tells a story, and you know, this is one of those books that it was quite simple when reading it, but it gave me a lot to think about afterwards. And there was another book that I read that did the similar thing of like kind of running parallel stories where, you know, heroes and villains, who's the hero, who's the villain, gets like played into tropes, but then the reader is left to really contemplate. There really are no heroes and villains. Everybody's quite complex, and they're playing roles or playing parts inside of these situations of life. So in the story you know, the shell of this story is about a young boy, really, Amir. I believe his name is, although at one point he tells someone his name is David, who is on a refugee seafaring vessel. And we spend half of the book on this vessel, and we get to know the smuggler, sort of, and his complex role in all of this, and the experience that's happening on the boat that's making its way towards Europe. Closest entry point is an island in Greece, and then the other part of the book is told as the after. No one has survived except for Amir on this boat, and he is washed up on this island, and he is found by a local girl, young woman, and she tries to help him sort of escape the clutches of immigrant detention or refugee detention that's happening on this island. And then we get to meet the colonel. I'm hoping I'm saying that name because those hierarchies of the military. Anyway, we get to meet the person in charge, the military character in charge of immigrant enforcement, and the sort of complexity of that character as well. And those are the two parallels that we see between the smuggler, who's sort of the captain of the ship, and then the immigrant enforcement. There's a lot of humanity in this book, and this book was probably, definitely incredibly salient when it was published as, I believe Europe called it the migrant crisis, where these stories were hitting the news, and the ways that they were being told needed a lot of interrogation, because the ways that stories were told in the news really completely undermined humanity. And I think Omar El-Akkad, who is a journalist, saw an opportunity to let's bring some humanity, and let's not make it sort of so easy to be like, you're a villain, you're a hero. We're all humans, and to really show the humanity. And I think he met that aim. He met that aim. Another book I read about the sea was Beasts of the Sea by Ida Turpinning. And this book is both, it's really about the relationship between humans and the sea and nature. It's translated from the Finnish by David Hackerston. I'm glad I read this book, but I didn't enjoy it at all. It was both too scientific and too historical for my fiction, and although I'm a nonfiction reader, or have been for years and years before I made a kind of quick switch to fiction, a pretty abrupt switch to fiction in the last year and a half. This isn't necessarily my area of interest, reading in nonfiction, but that's kind of why I like fiction. It gets you into context. This takes place in the north. So the Bering Strait, actually we start, speaking of, with a Captain Bering, and his mission to the Arctic, which failed, and then the Strait and many other things are named after him. We look at the plight of the sea cow into extinction. We look at the emergence of natural history museums, and sort of that as just that in science and in history. If any of those things seem at all exciting to you, read this book. There is not a whole lot of, I think there's even some character depth, but all that sort of the character and the plot kind of takes a back seat to this telling, this historical telling is what I'll say. Another book that I read about the sea, which was completely different than the two that I have just mentioned, was Samantha Hunt's The Seas. Loved this book, really messed with me. This book is some part fairy tale, part tragedy, part sort of fever dream. We are experiencing there's a coming of age situation of a young girl whose father disappears into the sea, and this girl believes, rather because she's can't deal with grief, or because it's true, because that's how fairy tales actually work, that her father was from the sea, and that they're mer people and she's a mermaid, and that his body has never been found, so he didn't die by suicide in the sea, rather he just went back from whence he came. And she believes she's a mermaid, but she's really struggling with the tellings of mermaids because they're very misogynistic, and she's trying to, she's trying to reckon with she's not that kind of a mermaid, but that's not really what a mermaid is. This book does so many things. It's emotionally fraught. was so confused. I wanted it to be a fairy tale because I wanted to get away from this very stark exposure of trauma, and what trauma can do, and ways in which we escape via alcoholism or drug addiction or even madness, um, or even fairy tales, right? The introduction by Maggie Nelson is great. So if you end up getting this version, what a beautiful book. And, you know, I know that whatever I said seemed a bit convoluted, but that's this book. Loved this book. And it comes, you know, under high recommendation for me, for folks who like literary fiction and don't mind and like to be confused, so that they can really, like, it's the confusion that makes you say, well, what is it that I actually really have to sort out, right? What opinion do I want to have, or which vein of the story do I really want to have? The last book about the sea, no, there's two, but I'll talk about the last one and not in this section of the sea, was Underwater by Tara Minon, and I had this both in audio and digital. So I thought I was reading this for the Women's Prize for Fiction, but alas, no. I don't know how I came to read this book, but I did, thinking I was reading it for the Women's Prize, because I started to be quite like, no, I need to like not read so many just digital books and focus on some of my physical, even if I have an audio or digital copy. As a hybrid situation, I have all these books and I read these books and then I give them away to people who I have told that I read the book and loved and they want to give it a try, and or I put it in a little free library or donate it to the Friends of the Library. That's my situation. So this week, more than ever, I had more, yes, by far more, just only digital, audio digital, meaning I don't have the physical copy, or access to the physical copy. And that's how I ended up reading Under the Water by Tara Minon. In Tara Minon, we have another coming of age, and this is an exploration of deep spirit. Speaking of fairy tale, I think the description says like fairy tale friendship between two girls as they live together on a resort in Thailand. There's also it's also looking at domestic violence and its impact on children, and it's also looking at climate. And I think all of the books that I just mentioned, that is a theme that that runs throughout, but this one's primary focus, Underwater's primary focus is definitely, it's a climate fiction book, I would say. And I would also say that, okay, so in Thailand, the main character's father is that's running like with Beasts of the Sea, is a biologist. And that's how she's there, and they experience the tsunami. So this book also looks at grief, because people who experienced that horrible, horrible tsunami that hit 2002, 3, it says in the book, and I just have the picture, I no longer have the copy, but the very big tsunami that impacted Southeast Asia, but in this particular telling in Thailand, experienced a great deal of loss. So there was loss of personal people, and if you didn't lose personal people, you still had to deal with sort of like mass deaths. And then we come back to kind of present time, and she's living again in New York, and she's really thinking about the impact of she's thinking back to her childhood. So we have several of the books that I read this week where they're either coming of age or thinking of their childhood. And she's experiencing Sandy, and her experience with Sandy is greatly impacted. Like she's traumatized by the giant tsunami. So her experience with another storm and living through another storm is magnified. And yeah, we have a lot of description of sea. We have a lot of love of the sea in this book and in the seas. Yeah. And in Beasts of the Sea. So I got really cozy with the sea this week. Okay, Women's Prize for Fiction. Gloria, Don't Speak by Lucy Epps. Yeah, this book is incredibly impactful. This book is told from the point of view who's somebody who's disabled. The description in the book is it's a learning disability, and this person is mostly nonverbal, but is verbal sometimes. We really see, as it's told from this person's point of view, this struggle to create verbal communication, and then the complexities and difficulties and barriers that arise in this protagonist's life without having verbal communication as the assumed by like an ableist society, the way that we all should be able to communicate, and therefore how we get things done, we understand, how we witness, how we explain, and also how we cope with trauma. Is that in this book there's plenty of trauma. We also look at loneliness through someone who is nonverbal, but although they don't have the ableist style to relate with other humans, they still very much, this main character, still very much wants and needs human relations. There's a lot of loneliness. There's a lot of the look at how vulnerable people are made. People are made by our systems and by predatory, toxic masculinity. Yeah, this was probably one of my favorite Women's Prize for Fiction books, and it stands out, longlist books from this year, and it stands out from the others because it is quite unique. It's a short read, it's an impactful read, and it's not lighthearted at all. Likely not lighthearted. We have Kingfisher by Rosie Kelly back in Yorkshire for this book. And in this book, I think the main themes, what I can say, so this video isn't too long because I have several more books to talk about, is love and the different ways that we love, and what is functional love and what is toxic love. And I had a conversation about this just with a friend the other day outside of this book, and so that was really resonating with me, that there's a lot of ways in which we use other people or allow ourselves to be used, to be needed, wanted, or loved, that are looked at in this book. Does that make it any more or less love in and of itself? This book is about grief. We experience deaths in this book, and this book is about sexuality and its relationship to love, and the fluidity therein. A Guardian and a Thief by Megha Majumdar. So Megha Majumdar's A Guardian and the Thief does have some similarities to What Strange Paradise, in that we have two parallel stories. We have one running of a woman who is, and her small family, aging father and young child, who have got climate refugee visas to come to Michigan to join her husband in some distant but very easy to understand future, or imagine, like not very speculative future, and they've waited a very, very long time to get these visas. She collects the passports. She keeps them in a sort of safe place in her house, and a thief enters her house and steals her purse and the passports in the purse, amongst other things, food to eat, because during this crisis, this climate crisis, we have food disparity and food shortage, and clean water disparity. We then look at the point of view of the person who stole the passports and the conditions of their life that led them to those decisions. We learn that the woman is herself a thief, and both these characters are guardians because they're trying to do their best to help their families survive. So they are not just looking at individual survival, they're trying to help make it so that their families will survive, all overshadowed by this billionaire who is very clearly in the book taking more resources than, like, this person is opulent. There's opulence. There's opulence in juxtaposition to, like, the threat of death, like survival due to, like, not actually having food. And then so we get to look at, you know, who's a guardian and who's a thief, and what's justified and what's really, like, where's morality, or how easy it is to judge. There's a lot of that, and then a lot of also speculation of folks are thrown into these roles and then put sort of in a stratified in some kind of, like, made up hierarchy, when in fact it's opulence all around. That was all of them were heavy. A guardian and a thief, maybe a little bit less, but certainly not more than A Burning, was a very, very bleak and heavy book. So I was really happy to I actually listened to The Ferryman and His Wife by Frode Brighton, and the translator is Alison McCullough? Yeah. Which was more, it's sort of like Frederick Bachman style, heartwarming. We do have grief. We absolutely have grief, and we have reflection. We have reflection of life and what it all means, which was similar to Paradise 17 in some ways, and some of the first books I talked about. But it was quite short, and there's some magic realism in this ferryman. It's the last day of his life, and he somehow knows it, and he embarks on his ferry, which he's done his whole adult life, which goes across the fjord. So we get a lot of, like, again, sort of rural setting, which we have in The Seas and The Beast of the Sea, but in this way, it's more of a romanticized sort of rural setting in some ways. He's meeting the ghosts of, you know, his dog and people that he knew throughout his life, and we get to learn, there's sort of like little anecdotes of the connection he had with these folks now passed, as he's preparing for his passing. We certainly get more water in this book, and relationship of people on boats and in water, and where there's definitely content warnings such as, you know, violence and suicide ideation, domestic violence and suicide ideation, amongst many of these books. There's this really sort of, like, heartwarming feeling, and that is the more the tone of this book. That there's some kind of closure, and there's a little bit of romanticism of how this story is told. Unlike some of the other books, like The Seas, which was like, take the fairy tale, or take the, like, you get fairy tale or you get harsh, brutal, tragic reality. So that's it. 33 minutes later. Those were the books that I have read since the last video that I made. And I'm moving this week. Yeah, it's more of the same. I have a book that I started this morning that I have been really excited to get started. So I'm excited to talk about that in the next wrap-up video, or maybe if I can even get myself to do a TBR. I have two more, I believe, that I plan to read, Women's Prize for Fiction longlist books. And then, a couple of other books that just fall into those categories that I brought up before. So we'll see what I get to, and until next time, happy reading.